game design video.
Wow.
It's been a minute.
Game design.
That's what we talk about on
What
this
even
channel.
is that?
Yeah. We're going to talk about the Hawthorne Effect and how we think that it has shaped modern gaming.
Distraction makers.
So let's describe what is the Hawthorne Effect.
So the Hawthorne Effect is a type of behavioral reactivity in which individuals modify an aspect of their behavior in response to their awareness of being observed. So this stems from some studies that were done over the course of the 1920s involving Hawthorne Western Electric Plant, where it was actually a bunch of various studies trying to test productivity of employees. And there was lots of little like false positives, different data that they were getting from these studies.
Scientifically, this is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. Someone might perform better if they're being observed, but we're discussing it in terms of the effect that we've seen it have on the preferences of gamers. Players' decisions both being meaningful and impactful to the experience that they're having, but then also those decisions being observed either by their teammates in some instances or other players.
Most extreme version of this is, like you said, all actions are being observed and all of the actions that you take matter.
Yeah.
And this would be a game like League of Legends. And then you have a game where none of your actions are being observed, but all of your actions matter. And that would be something like Auto Battlers. We have all of your actions are being observed, but none of your actions matter.
Probably in sort of the friend slop kind of category of games where you're playing with your friends and they're observing what you're doing, but nobody's really taking the game all that seriously.
And then you have games where you're not being observed and none of your actions matter. And I mean, it's hard to justify whether this is actually for a game or not, but essentially it's a game where there's a high amount of randomness in it that you're playing on your own.
It's not to say that like none of your decisions matter, but there's definitely like a high level of randomness involved. This is also, sometimes these games would be in the category of games of chance if it has sort of no meaningful decisions. With sort of that framework established, let's get into sort of the trends that we have seen in modern gaming and in some ways the downfall of competitive gaming. We want to start with what we saw as maybe the peak of competitive gaming generally. And for me, I think that was the sort of ascendancy of League of Legends. The next big thing was that video games were going to become akin to sports, and there was an extreme focus on what would be considered, in this framework, actions that are highly observed both by teammates, opponents, and fans in that environment, and then also all of the decisions being immensely meaningful. And League of Legends, I think, is just the perfect example of the culmination of all of this side of this spectrum, right? It's again, everything matters, everything is being observed, and it puts players in a pressure cooker, right? It's a very particular type of player that wants to have that experience.
With the rise of League of Legends being sort of esports and the esports scene in general coming up, we also saw a rise in live streams and streamers on Twitch. And so when we were seeing this sort of rise of streamers, we're seeing a rise of people that are being observed not only within the game, but in a meta form of the game as well, which leads to other types of altered behavior, right? Because now you're not just trying to be good at this game, but you're being watched while playing the game in multiple senses.
You're trying to be entertaining.
You're trying to be entertaining, right? Or you're trying to be extra good, right? You're trying to get these like extra good kills, not for your team, but to do something flashy for the people that are watching you.
If you're playing League of Legends with your friends or with your teammates, I think that's a much different experience than if you're playing it just trying to do random pickup games where players are all anonymous and they're never going to see each other again, and there's just sort of put into this environment where it's really easy to point the finger at the other players for doing something wrong. And then also there's no mechanism for, I suppose there's like, you can report other players for toxic behavior, but like there really wasn't, especially early on, much of a mechanism to curb any of this kind of toxic mocking or hazing or pointing the finger and saying you're the problem behavior, which then is exacerbated by any kind of a streamer who would be the feedback loop that happens there is that if a streamer is acting poorly in a competitive context and is gaining viewership because they are being funny or and sort of adding to this toxicity in this game space, you get this feedback loop of players acting poorly being rewarded for it by the people that are watching them, and then those viewers also then mimicking that behavior and bringing it into the games as sort of this feedback loop of negative behavior generally.
Games and the real world too, right?
Sure.
That's what kind of leads to meme culture. League at its systems level is just a very competitive game. If you compared it to something like Smash Bros, like multiplayer Smash Bros, even tag team Smash Bros or something, Smash Bros is a game that, when played 1v1, even potentially on teams, is a viable competitive sport. But what they do in order to sort of curb the casual nature of the game, they'll add items in, and those items that spawn randomly in different locations and stuff, give other players sort of chance to go and get ahead in some way. But that randomness then it reinforces that casual nature. So while it still is a game where all of your actions are being observed, all your actions matter, because of other elements that the game introduces, like items, or if you're playing casually in like a free-for-all mode or something, that inherently lends itself towards a casual audience, which I think leads to less stressful outcomes.
Classic Richard Garfield sense of, for there to be a lower barrier to entry, to add more randomness and reduce returns to skill, not reduce all of the skill component, but now you're adding in additional factors to not only make the players who are good at the game have to react to new situations, but also more casual players able to have a chance to win against more skilled players, and widening the buckets of players that can play against each other and have meaningful games. I think we reached the peak of the observed, all your decisions being extremely impactful with sort of the League of Legends esports experience. And after that, I think we start to get the pendulum swing. And it's when we start to see games experiment with connections to the Hawthorne Effect, right? To the idea that people act differently when they're being observed. And I think the first sort of inclinations of this that we get are things like auto battlers, where we start to see, like, these are games that are still very strategy focused, but we start to see the decision-making parts being moved behind a curtain effectively, so that you as the player don't feel like you're being observed while you're making critical decisions that might be judged by other players.
And it's hard to say why culturally this is shifting. If it's because what's happened, like you said, is that we saw this peak in competitive gaming. And I think a lot of people see gaming through the lens of Twitch and live streamers and content creators.
Well, especially competitive gaming.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, but what happens is, because there's it's such a high stress scenario to be in as a competitive gamer, we're seeing a lot more streamers lend themselves towards this sort of like friend slop, or even towards these things that maybe allow more agency, more time for you to go and consider your actions in a competitive state. So more turn-based gaming or something like that. Or lower stress environments, like something like a Vampire Survivors.
I think there's a synergistic relationship there too, right? Where these games that have downtime in the decision-making aspects of things work pretty well with moving back and forth with streamers talking to their audience, right? So we do get that positive feedback loop again, but now it's a different loop,
right,
where you have this ability to interact with the audience better rather than it being a spectacle of them just watching. There's now more back and forth communication. With the ability to slow down, make decisions, discuss decisions, and then go back and observe how those decisions play out in an auto battler.
It shifts this observation from a competitive state into like a cooperative state, right? Where now you're actually able to go and be the entertaining streamer by going and say, "What do you think, chat?" And you look at the camera and you go, "I don't know. Do I pick this or do I pick this?" And that's how you got the game like the Bazaar.
With Commander Magic, we see a similar kind of situation unfolding, and I think this is part of what makes Commander feel more casual, even though the game itself, the sort of systemic mechanisms, the complexity of the game is not particularly casual. But because there are other players at the table, you don't feel like your behavior is nearly as scrutinized, right? When it's your turn, a lot of times people aren't taking the game as seriously, theoretically. But when it's your turn, you're sort of like able to think about what you want to do whatever it is you're doing. Most of the time your friends are chatting with each other or doing something else or whatever, and then coming back to, oh, is it my turn yet? All right, let me do my turn real quick. Let me pass the turn. And as you move up the sort of competitive aspects of Commander that are available, that's when you start to get back to that hyper scrutinization of what plays you're making. And if I'm being honest, I do think that CEDH here is running into a kind of similar problem that League of Legends can, in that there's the ability for you to blame other players for playing poorly and causing you to lose. If we're following the through line, I do think that CEDH is set up to be in a similar kind of toxic environment as League of Legends, except you're not anonymous, which is a huge deal. The fact that you don't have anonymity for the most part in CEDH means that your behavior carries
Right. So it's actually not quite as bad as League.
Not quite.
Because of that.
Yeah. If it was played online, it very well could be. Like,
sure.
You're just anonymous.
Yeah. I think if you're going and playing 1v1 Magic and that's how you're learning, it could be a very frustrating experience if, like, let's say you miss a land drop on your third turn, right? Or you feel like someone is clearly playing against you and their creatures are going at you or they're casting spells on you, and you feel the like overwhelming impact of them as it's just it's wave after wave crashing into you, and that's it, right? There's a lot of stress, as opposed to, Commander lends itself towards, well, no one's going to hit, anyone as long as someone has 1 to 2 creatures on the board for however many turns, until someone can just go over the top of their creatures.
I feel like the decisions still matter, but they're sort of less impactful, right? As long as it's like, okay, who do I want to attack? Everybody's got blockers. Okay, I'll pass, right?
Right.
And I feel like that's a very casual Commander perspective.
I mean, it means that you can essentially take your actions, right? Your actions matter, and that you're still playing to the board state, you're still affecting it. But as long as you're contributing to the board state in some way on your turn, it means that you can still feel like you're making an impact without moving towards the win condition in reality,
Right. Let's move on to the sort of next evolution. Your behavior is being observed, but your decisions don't matter all that much. And we've seen a huge influx of games sort of in the Steam indie space, like hyper indie space, of what is affectionately called friend slop,
right?
Which are games where you and your friends are hanging out, you're observing each other, you're doing some kind of activity, but ultimately it doesn't really matter all that much.
It does seem like as we're shifting more towards this, like you're saying, that we are seeing this rise of friend slop because it's this observed space, but without the pressure of your actions mattering, without the pressure of you feeling like you have to improve your skill at something, right? You're just cooperating without the pressure to feel like you need to perform something.
Overcooked in this example, I think, is interesting because your actions at Overcooked do still feel quite meaningful. And so I do wonder if that's part of what attracts me to that. And having been somebody who has played in high stakes competitive environments with Magic, I do think that maybe my resistance to that experience is much like I'm more okay with that experience than a lot of other players are. And so I can recognize that, like, while I enjoy Overcooked, there is a level of stress involved in it. There's a level of performance anxiety, I suppose, that is associated with Overcooked that isn't there in some of these other friend slop games.
I do think I'm probably there with you because I'll play Overcooked with some people, and I feel like after maybe like 3 to 4 levels, people are like, I can't keep doing this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why? We just got started. I'm
like,
let's
get
go.
the tomatoes chopped, get the meat cooked, that thing's on fire over there, turn it off, get your plates, get on the plate, get into the window.
I think it's very fun. I think it's great.
Yeah, no, that's fun.
Yeah. It's so much so that when playing a friend slop game, I almost like default to
you start getting
turn it into that.
Mode?
Yeah, like I turn it into that because I think that that's fun, even if it's not actually as serious.
Like, how serious can we take this friend slop game? Okay, so finally we come to your decisions are basically effectively meaningless, and there's no real observable behavior here. And this is when we start to get into sort of games of chance, casino games. Most of them fall into this category. It's not to say that these games aren't valuable. Something like Balatro is really interesting. And part of that is because Balatro, I think, balances pretty well where the sort of decision-making matters and also the randomness is still involved. So like the returns to skill for Balatro are there. But I do think in this sort of category, the thing that we start to think about is the excitement that can come from being observed. We kind of talked about this a little bit where even if like your decisions don't matter, and it's all a game of chance, it's still interesting to like win that game of chance while others see you do it. And you can kind of like impart, like, I did this, even though it was totally random. I think we see this effect generally at casinos, right? Where being in kind of a public environment versus like, oh, I'm gambling in a slot machine online. I think those are a much different level of excitement involved.
It's a much different experience when you're trying to achieve something on your own versus achieving something and seeing a lot of other people watching you achieve that thing. It can, I think, heighten that experience overall because it means that even through the pressure of observation, you still did that thing.
As humans, we tend to value and give meaning to the things we do based on whether or not somebody saw us do it, right? Like there is a community aspect to this, a really human motivation to be observed while doing something. And I do think that if we come back around to auto battlers, I think that is kind of the the crux of that genre and why why it's enjoyable to people is that you get to make these decisions behind closed doors, but then feel like when your machine or whatever it is that you're building executes and does the thing it's supposed to do, somebody saw it happen, therefore it's meaningful.
Auto Battler sort of took the strategy of real-time strategy and removed the stress of real-time from it, but still allows you to sort of scratch that itch of like, well, okay, I have this many resources, what am I going to go and make so that I can sort of output that into my machine, right? Instead of having to have all the micromanaging of trying to make sure I'm moving my Terran Marines, around a map or whatever, and like going and bouncing out my Zerglings at the right time. Instead, I just have to worry about, well, how many things can I make with my resources so I can make my giant ball of units and send it at my opponent or whatever. That's kind of what auto battlers are.
And the units do the thing that they just do. And that's all. Yeah. So it's also important to note here that part of the Hawthorne effect is also related to like practicing, right? Like a musical instrument or practicing painting before you would show somebody a painting, that kind of a thing. And I do think that this relationship between I'm able to remove myself from observation and I'm able to sort of experiment and do the things and try things out without being observed and then choose when I'm presenting those things to people. I think that cycle is extremely important, just like generally for creativity and learning and understanding, having that ability to make mistakes and feel like you can make them and no one is going to judge you because nobody's there to witness it, right? And it's tough because like you can even be your own critic in those instances, right? Where you're observing your behavior still and judging yourself for making those mistakes. And I think that's also a difficult skill to practice. So I do think that, I don't know, it's tough because if we're sort of removing the idea of the Hawthorne effect, we're sort of like swinging the pendulum so far the other direction that like none of our behavior is observed and none of our decisions matter. I wonder if it becomes more difficult to practice that idea so that if we're balancing it between this practice thing that I'm talking about, between like, okay, I'm practicing playing the violin or whatever, and you're judging yourself in those moments, I wonder if it becomes more difficult for you to detach yourself and be able to just experiment, because you haven't practiced the idea of doing that while being observed. Do you get what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Where like if in any instance, you're still sort of observing if you're judging yourself. So without practicing removing that judgment or being okay, like letting that judgment exist, if you're not practicing operating in an environment where you could be judged, can you ever operate by yourself without judging yourself? You know what I'm saying?
Is there a point in comparing yourself to others if there's no one else to compare yourself to?
Okay, so one of my tricks to get myself over a hurdle, if I'm like struggling with the fact that I'm making something and I'm worried about, okay, I really want it to be good and I'm sort of getting caught up in my own head, is I'll kind of detach myself from it and say, well, this isn't like the masterpiece thing that you're going to make, right? It's just one of the things that I'm going to make, and therefore it matters less, right? In the grand scheme of like building up to the really big thing that I really want to make, because you can get paralyzed when you're worried about how it's going to be perceived. Yeah. And so learning how to detach yourself from that, that's kind of what I'm getting.
You're not trying to make a masterpiece. You're just trying to do the best you can. Is I think the difference in mentality, because I think there's some people that like the idea of a masterpiece is such an intangible thing, right? Because if you've never made that, right? If you're looking at other people and that's the perception of, well, that's what I think a masterpiece is, but I've personally never made that, but you're making something that's just slightly different from that, but up to that par, you don't know how to make sure that you're actually on even ground with that. So instead, all you can opt for is, well, I could just do like what I can, right? Like you're going to do your best with it.
If our only mechanism, the only thing we've learned about how to detach ourselves from judgment is to make it so nothing matters, I think that we end up in a situation where that's all we know and how to deal with it when we're judging ourselves, is to basically say, well, why try? Why bother? Nothing matters. Nothing's going to come of this. Instead of learning that, yes, you might be observed, you might be judged, but it's not going to be the end of the world. Like failure is not the end, right? It's not like if you fail, that's fine. It's part of the process.
Sure.
Even if it's a public failure, right? You get back up, you do it again, right? And if all we're learning from this is, well, we just exist in a world where nothing matters, therefore we can't ever fail because nothing matters. That's where I get hung up on this response to the Hawthorne effect. To bring it full circle back to the thing we're supposed to be talking about.
Sure. Well, and it's tough to say if like these lessons are there because I think observed failures has become so much easier for people to observe.
And I think there is a connection here to League of Legends, right, in this toxicity, because my competitive gaming experience was not that level of toxic, right? It was Friday Night Magic or Grand Prix or whatever with Magic, where it's not anonymous. It's sort of it's not like super casual, but it's a casual competitive environment. It's not this everything's on the line and everything always matters and you're being measured by a ladder and you have instant feedback as to whether or not you did good or bad, and playing a game against somebody you know you're going to lose against is just a losing proposition because you're just losing ranks and ladders. There was a great article that Richard Garfield wrote about the difference between casual tournaments and ladders and how casual tournaments create an ecosystem and create a community, and ladders don't really do that. So that being my competitive gaming background experience, I think taught me these lessons of experimentation and putting yourself out there and failing and having it be okay to get back up and keep going. Where if I was instead met with, you're a loser, you're an idiot, what are you even doing? Why are you even here? That's a much different experience.
So really, this is just talking about how the Hawthorne effect doesn't matter if the people watching you don't know who they are.
No, it does. It
does matter, but it means that instead you're just going to disengage.
Exactly. It becomes a sort of line in the sand of, if I want to continue doing this for whatever reason, I'm going to have to suffer through that toxicity, or I can just reject it and go play friend slop and never learn any of the lessons that I could have learned if I had been able in a less toxic environment.
Sure. This is somewhat related to, we had in our notes here in a mentioning of like auto battlers.
Yeah.
And that the direction of where certain games are going is that the direction that certain games end up sort of going is less disruptions involved in between turns, right? Like the less amount of time that it takes before a disruption or an interaction takes place is lengthening. And so normally, like we started with something like Magic or even real-time games, really is like in real time, anyone can do anything to you. But then it became Magic, which is now, you have this interaction space. Whenever you cast something, someone might have a response potentially. And then now we're getting into sort of this back and forth where you have like Lorcana, where there's no interaction.
Sort of sorcery speed gameplay.
And then there's auto battlers.
Auto battles, or like
and
a whole
auto battlers
step,
is essentially like you have as many actions as given, depending on the action resource system that they use, before you then just test your thing. And when you test your thing, you're not really like you're just kind of throwing it at someone and you're seeing if it works out, right? And so, a little anecdotal, but it's hard to say if that's because that's just culturally where we're headed.
Yeah.
Because of this observation effect.
Yeah. No, I think that I think that's a good way to wrap it up. I would like to see some of this casual competitiveness come back. I think that we got a little extreme with the esports trajectory and the sort of hyper competitive streamer focused esports thing that happened. I think that showing that there's a different world there for competitive play, and one that is very meaningful and also accepting and welcoming and not toxic, and there's lessons to be learned there from that experience, that I think that to me is pretty important. But yeah, because that was my experience.
I think there's valuable experiences there, and I also think that generally, if designers were to not worry so much about following certain trends, I think what's frustrating is how many people are either taking a lesson purely from following the sort of popular trend of friend slop, or prior to that, a little while at this point, it was copying esports. It was everyone's trying to make the next esport. Which no one's really trying to do nowadays, thank God.
I mean, it all kind of came crashing down. So.
Right. But I wish that more people would look at something like Smash Bros. As a good model, where you can have a viable competitive format, but you got to make sure that there's something there for casual players to feel like they don't have to worry about being observed, or the way that they're being observed is being done a little bit differently. You're giving them an outlet for their actions to either matter less, for their observations to not feel as stressful, whatever that is, right? But it's taking that into consideration for all the different player groups that are playing your game. Or you're just keeping in mind what player group is playing your game, right? Keeping in mind, do the players that play this game want to feel observed? Do they want to feel like their actions matter? Whatever it is, right? That's what you're designing for. If you enjoyed listening to us talk about the Hawthorne Effect and maybe a bunch of other stuff you weren't expecting, please feel free to give us a like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
If you want to read a bunch more stuff that you might not be expecting, you can join our Discord. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
It's just a bunch of Sonic fan fiction.